World changes. Welcome to another episode of the How to Save the World podcast. Today's guest is Jeremy Hoffman. He is a climate and earth scientist at the Science Museum of Virginia, and he has a PhD in paleoclimatology. We are going to be talking about a fabulous experiment that Jeremy headed up in the city of Richmond, Virginia, where he attached thermometers to people's cars and bicycles as they moved around the city in order to track the urban heat island effect. And we'll be talking about the fascinating and frightening things that he's discovered. Thank you so much for joining me on the show today, Jeremy.
Thank you for inviting me, Katie. I'm really excited to be here.
That's awesome. So let's start with you explaining what is the big problem with concrete and asphalt?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So not so much a problem as it is this really fascinating scientific property of cement and asphalt. So as humans developed these big things called cities where most of us live now, they actually changed the way that a natural landscape interacts with that big ball of energy in the sky, the sun. And basically, asphalt, cement, bricks, these sorts of urban environments, or what a lot of people would call the built environment, actually absorbs more of the sun's energy during the day than a natural landscape would, and then re-emits that throughout the day and through the night, actually artificially raising the local temperature in a city relative to the non-urbanized rural areas just outside of the city.
And how big a difference is the temperature gap between the natural area and the built area? It's full of concrete.
That's another really good question. So it depends on how you actually are looking at the urban heat island effect. So there are two main ways that people generally like to look at this problem. One is using satellite imagery, where a satellite passes by the same area once a week or something like that kind of frequency, and you actually see just the temperature of the surfaces, kind of like if you were going to touch a hot pan, that's the surface temperature. Now, there's another way to evaluate the urban heat island effect, and that is through the air temperatures. Now, that's more like where we're walking around, where people are living in the cities. A lot of the times, the amount of temperature difference is larger when you look at satellite imagery. So say a black or dark roof on a building could be 160 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, that doesn't mean that the air temperature where humans are kind of interacting with the city is actually 160 degrees. But some big differences in satellites might be, 20 to 25 degrees. And then in our study, to kind of, ruin the surprise, we saw a 15-degree difference in air temperatures between some of the coolest and warmest places in the city.
Right, because that's a really big difference, right? Like 15, 20 degrees. And we're talking in Fahrenheit all here, right? I mean, I saw in one report that the actual surface temperature, like a black roof, could be 90 degrees hotter than the air temperature. So you've got these sizzling surfaces, which you'd know of if you walked on something with bare feet in summer. It's really hot. But just all of this urbanization creates these big temperature differences. And I'm not sure if people really realize what a significant issue this is for local climate change. I saw one study that said that the urban heatline effect could exacerbate local climate change by a factor of 30%. So when we talk about climate change, we often talk about carbon dioxide and the greenhouse effect. But one thing that I find really fascinating about this area is that we often think about climate change as being about carbon dioxide emissions and cars and coal power stations, but the urban heat island effect creates climate change in itself without worrying about CO2. Can you explain a bit about how this big temperature difference is actually creating local climate change that's really not about coal power stations and cars?
The really fascinating thing in Richmond is that when we look at kind of local weather records and we divide things into statewide, so the entire state of Virginia, and then our climate division, which is a smaller subset of the entire state, but still where Richmond resides, it's called the Eastern Piedmont Climate Division. And the warming rate over the last several decades has been about 0.4 degrees Fahrenheit across the entire climate division. But when we look at the actual warming rate within the city of Richmond, that ends up being about 0.5 degrees Fahrenheit warming over the last several decades. So we, living here in the city of Richmond, are seeing a faster rate of climate change relative to the rural areas. And that's simply because of the same thing that we've been talking about, these large swaths of paved areas, removing green infrastructure like trees and green spaces, and as the cities expand, and what's really fascinating about the city of Richmond right now is that we're reevaluating kind of places where we can actually redevelop to fit all the people that want to move here because it's an awesome city, and figuring out as the city grows, we might actually exacerbate that warming rate even further by expanding that urban region and widening that sphere of influence of the heat island effect.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. This one study that I read showed that you could actually exacerbate it 30%. We've got existing climate change, and then we've got the heat island effect exacerbating it by 30%. So the more I've looked into it, it actually seems to be a much bigger, scarier issue than I'd ever thought of before.
What I find really interesting is that, at least here in the state of Virginia, we're projected to be the 10th most populous city by the mid-century. And most of that growth is going to take place in our urbanized centers. So in Richmond, in the Northern Virginia, just outside of DC, and along the coast. And what a lot of people don't connect, they see climate change as this very far off problem, but really the urban heat island effect is something that can intensify in the order of a few years, whereas we might see, hopefully really slow kind of climate changes due to human emissions of carbon dioxide. What's really amazing about the urban heat island effect is not only is it something that can rapidly expand, and there's a report came out in 2014 that showed like 60 cities across the United States are seeing more rapid climate change relative to their rural outside. But actually, this is something that we can fix on the order of a few years. So whereas global climate change seems like a very far off, distant problem that is really hard for us to fix within our own communities, the urban heat island effect is one of those things that we could literally fix overnight, if you will, in little pockets of our own communities.
Yeah, that's really exciting. And we'll talk about things that we can do a little bit later. But what I want to get into is peak electricity demand and air conditioning. So we've already experiencing climate change exacerbated by urban heat islands. Then everybody turns on air conditioners, right? In the city where it's really hot, what we're saying up to 20 degrees Fahrenheit. I mean, what does that do to the electricity grid, and how does that affect our reliance on coal power plants?
The fascinating thing about heat waves in cities is that even though the rural areas right outside of the city might also be hot, it's actually worsened in the city. So people want to cool down their homes. They want to be comfortable. They want to avoid getting heat sickness and heat-related illnesses and that sort of thing. So they all turn on their HVAC systems, their air conditioning, all pretty much at the same time, and create these kind of like massive loads on the grid. And what that can cause are kind of rolling blackouts. And in fact, while it's hard to link them directly in the city of Richmond, a lot of people do associate in the middle of the summer when the lights go out on a hot night, that's because everybody's trying to fight for the same amount of electricity. Now, what does that do? As we expand our cities and we need more of that air conditioning, then we're actually creating a greater need for, that electricity to be on demand for us. Now, what does that do? That drives up the consumption of these fossil fuels, which create carbon dioxide, a heat trapping gas. So what we can actually do is create a loop, a feedback loop, where as we have bigger cities, we need more electricity and we release more CO2, which warms the planet up more, and we still expand our cities. And so it's a self-reinforcing loop where we can actually make climate change worse by requiring more cooling. It's a really kind of a strange and challenging problem to have.
Well, I think it's really interesting because I think a lot of people don't quite understand the concept of peak load on the grid, that the grid is being used at different capacities all through a 24-hour cycle. And when people put on their air conditioning, that really is a peak of a peak. That's like a super peak, right? How do we fuel these peaks? It's like the only way it can be done is through extra coal power stations. So I get the feeling that unless we can solve the urban heat island effect or create or make cities cool or help people be cool in cities, we're not going to be able to get away from coal. What do you think about that?
I think until we figure out a way, like you said, to have there be a different way to think about cooling down a city where we are not relying entirely on electricity in order to come to that cooling, we are going to rely on those sorts of fossil fuel powered generation plants. So yeah, I think you're absolutely right. We need to come up with these inventive ways. Well, first of all, I think we need to understand the extent of the problem in our cities. And then from there, address the community needs that are presented, and hopefully, have explicit goal for what we're trying to accomplish by addressing the urban heat island effect. But to return to your question, I do think that as our cities continue to grow and the urban heat island effect continues to worsen, we are going to rely on energy that right now comes from fossil fuel generation plants, whereas we could find potentially other ways to take care of that issue without relying on energy.
And in the study that you did, you got this super granular data from attaching these thermometers to different people. The studies, it's only been done in the city of Richmond so far. Is that right?
Actually, this work grows out of the complete and total genius of the Sustaining Urban Places Research Lab at the Portland State University. The story is kind of interesting. I met one of the faculty members in that research group, Vivek Chandas, through a mutual friend in my PhD work. And over breakfast one morning in Portland, Oregon, we were talking about their really inventive work doing this same sort of study in the city of Portland, Oregon. And I said, well, boy, it would be really great to do this in a humid southern city, kind of like Richmond, Virginia. And actually, they've performed this same kind of analysis in all over the world, in Mexico and in Qatar, and then now here in the city of Richmond. And we also have plans to continue this in other cities as well. So we're actually one of a few cities that have done this really kind of amazing, groundbreaking analysis.
What I want to ask you is, what is the problem that exists when cities don't have this data? So now you've got it for a few cities. What is that cities are suffering from when they don't have this data?
There are a few different things that we can address by getting this information. One of those is identifying the areas in the city where perhaps we are going to experience those peak loads that we talked about before. So just understanding where in the city are people most likely going to be using their HVAC systems at a very high rate during a heat event. Now, what else we can get into is not only looking at kind of like energy usage, but we can also be considering, are these people more vulnerable to these heat events than in other places in the city? So if you live in a really hot neighborhood that's warmer than other places within the city, do you also lack the kind of adaptive capacity that people would have in other parts of the city? So say a city park with ample trees. Are you surrounded by big black parking lots? Furthermore, what's the kind of makeup of the neighborhood itself? Are these communities those that have stable incomes to support that adaptive capacity? Can you buy an HVAC system? Can you buy fans? Can you afford bottled water? So there's all of these different variables that we already know about through the American Community Survey and the US Census Bureau. So we can start incorporating that heat data, which is one of the most, actually it is still the number one weather-related fatality and mortality thing is heat events, not storms or wind or tornadoes. It's actually heat. So understanding our community's vulnerability to these sorts of heat events is valuable in a lot of different ways. So we can address that kind of energy side of things and look at places where we could actively lower people's energy bills by cooling their neighborhoods. But then we also get this other added benefit of, wow, we're actually taking care of our citizens in this new way so that everyone in our city can be just as healthy and able to thrive in this urban environment.
One of the things I noticed from your study was this strong correlation between socioeconomic status and this really powerful social justice story that came out. Can you talk a bit more about the relationship between heat and social justice?
At a broad scale, I mean, scientists and climate scientists, social scientists have known that the kind of extreme heat that is expected to only increase, I mean, it already has increased due to climate change, but in the future, it will continue to get worse. That disproportionately affects these communities that don't maybe have the adaptive capacity to become resilient to those events. It might seem like, we're talking about a country very far away, but actually we're talking about communities in our own cities, places where you might not have access to a park, you might not have access to a cooling center, and maybe you have your parents work outside during the day and you are without health insurance. These are all data sets that we can access already. But then add on top of that the fact that they're going to be experiencing 20-degree Fahrenheit hotter temperatures during a heat event. And it becomes very clear that these communities might be at a higher risk for like heat-related illness and those sorts of ailments. Some other things that are really interesting is like asthma rates and actual check-ins to urgent care centers, calling for an ambulance. These are the sorts of things that we can see a pattern in the city, and it all seems to relate back to this urban heat island effect. Now, that creates a really unique challenge. Maybe some of these communities have been disenfranchised for a number of years, decades even. A major story in a lot of our American cities is one of kind of structural disenfranchisement of specific communities. And so what this information allows us to do is to really acknowledge that there are some systemic problems faced by certain communities that other communities within the same city do not experience. So without that information, without that physical environmental information that, wow, 20 degrees hotter in these certain communities, it just adds another dimension to not only the problem, but it adds this really interesting dimension to the solution as well.
What I see emerging is this quite frightening picture of extreme heat events exacerbated by the urban heat island effect, then putting load on the electricity grid that cause blackouts, and people even with money, or poor people as well, not being able to cool themselves and having a whole lot of heat-related deaths. I looked up heat-related deaths. People die of heat stroke, and it's a real thing. There was one heat wave in Europe where 15,000 people died. I mean, That's crazy. And they die. I just thought maybe, they just say they die, but maybe they were old and they were going to die anyway. But heat stroke is a very specific thing to die from. Like when you heat up and you die from heat stroke, that's how you die, because you just got too hot.
What's really interesting is our Virginia Department of Health has this really unique program called Essence. And basically what it is it's like a surveillance program where digital health records, as they're put into the system, actually track kind of like peaks in these different ailments. In the summer of 2016, the city of Richmond went from, I think it was like 75 degrees Fahrenheit on 4th of July to well into the upper 90s on the very next day. And so that you can actually see the jump in the people going to the urgent care centers and emergency departments for heat-related illness between those 2 days. And so the relationship already exists. Now, what's really interesting is that within those people that went to the hospital, you can actually start to pick out other sorts of trends. It turns out that young people and old people or elderly communities are much more vulnerable to these sorts of heat stroke and heat-related illness things. And then also men who tend to work outside. So we have these very distinct groups of people that are more vulnerable, or apparently more vulnerable, to these heat waves than others. With that backdrop, you can see how complex of an issue this can be within even just like a community level. And it provides some significant challenges, but also I think still some really amazing solutions that we can pursue that actually work to ameliorate this issue on the order of a few years.
Yeah, I think we've painted a pretty frightening picture. So it'll be exciting to talk about what we can do to to make it better. If anyone's listening, if they're not completely freaked out about how,
I mean, I would like to. I mean, it is something that it's something that's come about. Actually, what's really interesting is that the heat island effect has been understood. Well, not really understood, but it was first observed back in the 1800s. So this is not something that's like brand new about our cities. We've actually known about it for quite a while. But with the addition of human-caused climate change, it's actually exacerbating the problem. So, and as our cities continue to grow, it's certainly an opportunity to allow all of our citizens in cities to have equal opportunities, the ability to thrive under these new environmental conditions.
There's just one more factor to the feedback loop, this heat feedback loop, that I wanted to explore, that was refrigerants. Because refrigerants are used in air conditioning. So the more air conditioning we use, right, the more we're using these refrigerants. Have you seen that drawdown book that ranked all of the different, it was by Paul Hawken. They ranked all of about, I think it was 70 or 100 different climate solutions. And refrigerants came up number one.
I haven't read the book, but a lot of people point to that as this, fascinating, innovative book about these solutions that you might not have heard of before.
Yeah, what was interesting about the book is that they do quantify and rank all of the different solutions. And when we're talking about climate change, I feel it's very much in big oil, cars, turning the lights off, and coal power stations. refrigeration hasn't really been in the debate. Well, not what I've seen. I haven't seen it as explicitly in the debate as I've seen the other things that we commonly associate with climate change. And I just saw that as this other pretty significant part of this, what you talked about, of the feedback loop between, air conditioning and then needing extra HFCs to fuel the air conditioners.
There are so many of these different things. I agree with you that a lot of the times, we don't get to hear about these really inventive, innovative kind of solutions, because ultimately the number one solution is to reduce our emissions of heat trapping gases. So it's fun to look at these different sorts of short-term and long-term solutions. But I think that it is important to continue to stress that the number one way that we can fight climate change is by reducing those heat trapping gas emissions.
Well, it just puts just another big reason for why we need to use less air conditioning. And America is known for being obsessed with air conditioning. And where I come from in Australia, we don't have air conditioners. We just deal. Not that we don't have them, they do exist. They're not like extinct or anything, but they're rare. They're only really in libraries or shopping centers. It's quite rare to see someone, even in the warmer climates, to have one in their home.
That is interesting.
Deal.
I saw this interesting figure that on the West Coast, so we're on the East Coast and the hot, humid South, we've been a fan of air conditioning for a long time, no pun intended. But West Coast actually is one of the places where HVAC systems are on the rise. And it's kind of an interesting correlation that as the West Coast continues to get warmer in the summer, they're also using more and more air conditioning systems.
Yeah, I don't understand why people are so obsessed with temperature regulation. I think you've got to have just like a little bit of internal tolerance. You don't have to always have a heater on and an air conditioner on like constantly. But some people are, I don't know, maybe it's a cultural thing. People seem to be sensitive to it.
Well, and what's really interesting is the symptoms of heat-related illness. We have so many resources from the integrated heat health information system available through the NOAA resilience toolkit, and there's all this information out there about how to fight heat-related illness if you don't have access to these sorts of cooling centers or an HVAC system in your own house. I saw this really interesting thing in the state of Minnesota where they actually came up with an interactive map that you can access on your smartphone, and it shows places that are open that you can go to at that time to go and get away and get out of the heat. So if you don't have that sort of air conditioning system and maybe you're a little bit more gung-ho about having the no internal sensitivity to it, you can still take the steps necessary to protect yourself and your family from those sorts of heat-related illnesses.
Well, we use the wet towel in Australia.
Yeah.
You just cover yourself in wet towels completely,
right.
And it works. It's very effective. It sort of is weird. You feel like a swamp monster walking around in wet towels, but they're very effective.
Yeah, that's actually funny that you mentioned that. When we were out doing the heat island assessment, I rode my mountain bike. We have this fantastic urban mountain biking trail system in the city of Richmond. We had never measured using that ambient temperature sensors that we used in this field campaign. We had never gotten below the street level. So we used cars, but we also employed bikes to go on little pathways that people actually walk on in the city. So that provided us with this really, really fine-grained information about how hot it can get, even on like something like a trail where people are exercising. And that was one of the tactics that I used. It ended up being 110 degrees during the field campaign. I rode something like 10 miles on my mountain bike, and before I would leave on the traverse, is what we called it, but basically to go out and take measurements, I soaked my entire gear, my entire outfit with cold water and put ice cubes and ice packs in my
science.
jersey.
Do it for science. You see how much we suffer for our cause. We really do.
Exactly.
Let's move on to what we can do about it. What have you seen as being the most effective things that building owners and city planners can do? You said before that we could actually solve this, or solve a fair bit of it, in just a few years.
So I think ultimately, like I said before, is that the first step is understanding the extent of the problem. Doing some sort of analysis, finding some scientists, we accomplished a lot of this with citizen scientists and volunteers from the public in our city to really cooperate around understanding where hotspots are within the city. Now, I've seen some really amazing projects undertaken by different cities in ways of estimating this. So like I said, you can start with satellite imagery. That'll show you where surfaces like roads and buildings are existing hotspots. That might help you better understand where you can save money on cooling systems, because if you have a really hot roof, that building then might also experience more heat within it. So it might be cooling itself down more relative to a lightly colored roof. By using the satellite imagery, we can actually get at kind of those infrastructural changes in that we can have green roofs. The City Hall of the city of Chicago has this really amazing green roof on it. Places in California that you have to use reflective surfaces, like basically like white roofs that actually work to reflect the sun's energy instead of absorbing it. So by using satellite images, a community can understand the kind of problems that more relate to kind of those infrastructural problems of energy use. Now, by measuring that ambient temperature, human experiential level air temperature assessment, we get a better understanding of where our vulnerable populations are. So we can get a better hold of reducing the amount of people that go to the hospital during these heat waves. So it really centers on, what do you want to solve? Do you want to reduce kind of greenhouse gases and energy use in a city? Do you want to safeguard your populations? So you might imagine if you put a reflective roof on a building, that's not really going to affect people down on the street level. Whereas if you were to all of a sudden build a green park with ample trees and some sort of water features that actually work to cool the air at the level of people's experience, then you can kind of start to target what you want to accomplish. To really get at what you were asking about, from those two levels, there's been some really amazing things that I've seen done for both of those. The city of Baltimore did a bunch of urban greening to accomplish increasing shade at the ground level. That reduces the ambient air temperature of an area. Then also, the city of Chicago is one that has changed a lot of their roofs to actually be more reflective or green, basically increasing the albedo of the surface makes its temperature lower. Having some sort of intervention like increasing the number of cooling stations. So the city of Portland actually, through the work that Vivek and the Portland State University completed, they actually have just a better understanding of where they need to allocate resources to keep people safe during heat events. So there are a lot of these things that can implement on a very short time scale that have impacts right away. Planting a tree will reduce the temperature of the surface underneath it as soon as you're done swinging the shovel.
So what you're saying is that if you want to reduce electricity demand, you want to require less electricity, that's where green roofs and green walls come in, because they affect the building directly. But if we want to change the temperature of the whole city, we need to look at the public projects that are converting any kind of concrete or asphalt areas back to green space. But what about roads? I mean, I look at roads and there are these big baking hot surfaces. Is there anything that you've seen that we can do to help? I have this in my imagination, like a horizontal trellis, like this horizontal green trellis, covered in vines that shades roads. Have you seen any projects about what we can do about roads?
Yeah, I'll wrap parking lots in with roads because they're all generally made out of some sort of dark surface like asphalt or cement. I've seen some really amazing things that we would love to try here in the city of Richmond, including the city of Los Angeles has started a pilot program where they've painted a number of city blocks roads white. So they've actually made them highly reflective to the sun's energy. What this could do is actually reduce the air temperature right above them and then ameliorate that human level temperature along some of those blocks. I haven't seen any of the results from this study yet, but it did go around on social media a few months ago. So that's one thing that you could implement across both roads and parking lots. But I do see some issues potentially with that, in that as you drive a car that has dark, dirty tires over it, you're going to have to invest in cleaning that surface to keep its reflective properties intact. Now, something else that I've seen along your trellis idea, actually, Katie, is that Arizona State University and I think a few other universities and schools in the Southwest have actually started shading their parking lots with those sorts of kind of like roofs where people can still drive in and park under them. But then what they can actually do is cover those new awnings, if you will, with solar panels that then work to power the building that you're going into. One of the really cool things about battling the urban heat island effect is that we can start to gain all these other co-benefits from just fighting that urban heat island effect. We can actually generate electricity by creating shade in our parking lots. And potentially we can be really testing out these innovative solutions like painting roads white and trying to use different types of reflective surfaces in our infrastructure. A study basically using a computer model in the city of Los Angeles, they made all of the roofs white. What this did was actually increase the amount of UV light that was reflected back into the atmosphere and created more particulate matter and low-level ozone. So it actually made the air quality, it made the air quality worse and actually increased the number of exceedance days into the future. So
does that mean we should not paint things white?
I mean, I think that goes to show that there's a need to mix these strategies together. So using just one strategy is probably not going to be appropriate for an entire city. And I think it's really this kind of community level analysis that we've accomplished in the city of Richmond that really allows us to then tailor our solution for each individual community and what they want.
So the solutions we've got are green walls and green roofs, white roofs, maybe depending on the ozone, and white roads, maybe trellises, horizontal trellises if my idea happens, covering up car parks, covering up roads with roofs somehow, converting any kind of paved surfaces in a city, a kind of like a civic infrastructure project, having more green space. What do we need to do to expedite this? How do we sort of turn the solar-powered electric vehicle gas on to the development of all of these changes? I mean, if we can talk about it, right, and study it as scientists, but it has to actually happen in the real world. What do we do?
We're not just studying it here in the city of Richmond. We actually got kind of investment from a bunch of different groups that really make it a collaborative and cooperative solutions-based communication strategy. So we did have to do the science, but we included people from our community in that science project. So we actually had the volunteers go out in their cars and measure these heat islands. We have the city sustainability office in the city of Richmond has been instrumental in making this project work. And they've been helping guide what's useful to the city and not so much, it's not just academic curiosity that I'm following, along this line. It's actually very practical, needs-based interaction with the city government. Now, what really is required is that if people are interested in finding out maybe about programs that might be existing in their city, is to reach out to individuals in the city government, whether that's their city council person or the city sustainability officer, or in some cities, they even have chief resilience officers, and figuring out, are there programs going on right now that I can help contribute to, either through actually taking measurements using some sort of home weather station, or can I be, supporting some sort of city level initiative to increase green space? And I know a lot of the times you hear from climate scientists and people that advocate for climate change mitigation that it's like about talking with your legislators, but in this case it really is. And what's really great is that they're legislators that are in your own community. So the city council people and people from the city government are those people that you are probably most attached to already. As far as trying to reach out to a senator or a congressperson, I think it's easier to kind of make these connections within your own city. As far as what other things can we be doing, it really does start with talking to your neighbors. I think everybody knows what it is to walk through that big black parking lot during a summer day, and they feel that, it's like living inside someone's mouth or something, and then they that's, in some places it really does feel like that. And everybody can relate to that kind of uncomfortability. So starting with that shared value that we all don't like feeling that way, and how do we change it, I think is one of the most elegant ways that you can start that conversation. What's really great about the urban heat island effect is that it's something that would exist even if climate change wasn't real, which it is, and it's human caused. But even without us changing the climate, we would have been changing the city's climate anyway. So it's this really amazing thing that we get co-benefits that help us become resilient to human-caused climate change, while also increasing our city's capacity to make it a healthy place for everyone to live. So I think it's just this really amazing thing that we can all cooperate around and start the conversation in a lot of different places with a lot of different people. And it's something that, like I said, that we can solve nearly overnight, given the right kind of infrastructural changes.
And because climate change is so politically polarized in the United States, with people who are more conservative, not believing in climate change, and people who are more pro-environmental tend to be more liberal, like you said, if we can take carbon dioxide out of the debate of the urban heat island effect, it should, in theory, also remove that polarization that keeps, roughly 50% of the population kind of not engaging, or negatively very much engaging in the climate debate. And I thought it was really cool also what you said about engaging with your local government. I think engaging with government to try and achieve something is really, really daunting, even for the most devoted people who want to change the world and environmentalists. It just feels like this big brick wall that you can't get through. But if we were trying to lobby someone very senior in government, or like a national body, I think that's very difficult for an individual person to make an influence. But with local government, I mean, you really can make an influence, right? You can just call up someone, especially in a small city. You can just call up the hotline and get put through, and they'll probably meet a really friendly person who's happy to have a chat, as long as you've got something, a worthwhile idea. So I think people shouldn't be afraid of engaging in proactive local sustainability initiatives. You could have a car park near a school that you convert into a park. I mean, that could actually be really viable without having engineering skills, without being an architect or environmental engineer. You could get a group of concerned parents together and actually make that happen. I mean, have you seen any little projects like that come true?
Yeah. So one of my favorite ideas right now, and one that we're really pursuing with a nonprofit here in the city called Groundwork RVA. They're actually a national program, but our specific troop, if you will, or our organization local to Richmond, it's basically a education program for teens in the city of Richmond to learn green workforce skills. So like urban forestry, urban agriculture, and urban greening. So one of the coolest things is the idea of a pocket park. So you have a vacant lot.
A mini park, is that it?
Yeah, very, very small park. Yeah, pocket park. It's just like this wonderful idea that would only take an afternoon with a group of teens, say like a Boy Scout troop or a Girl Scout troop, or here in the city of Richmond, we have this Groundwork RVA, the Green Team. These teens in our cities really want to be involved in making their cities a better place. So I think by encouraging them to have that kind of role in saving the world by starting at their corner vacant lot has huge benefits for them long-term, as feeling like they need to be stewards of the natural environment, while also improving the quality of life right there on that small little plot of land. So it's really been this idea of pocket parks and very small urban agriculture programs that has had huge community engagement and engagement of the youth. It's basically a win-win for everyone. And making a city a healthy, livable place is what we all want for ourselves and for our kids and whoever else that is moving to our cities. So like I said, I think it's a win-win for everyone involved.
Yeah, so I think if the takeaway for people is that if you have somehow in your life are connected to a roof that appears to be hot, or you see paved surfaces around you and you want to do something about it, try and get a group of people together and see what you can do. Any bit of concrete or asphalt that you can cover up is an actual real move to helping climate change, and anybody can do it.
Yes, entirely. Anybody can do this. And what's amazing is we've felt like our group that has banded around this question, we've really started to develop a unique kind of collaborative, cooperative environment where people feel like we can actually do something really awesome over the next several years that might have seemed extremely daunting, as you said, and far away in the idea of global climate change. So, it can start as easy as getting an infrared camera and taking a picture of a parking lot on a hot day, and you will see right away where the hot spots are and where that urban heat island effect comes from. It's just amazing. It's a really cool scientific endeavor.
When you can buy them on Amazon, can't you? Pretty cheaply. I think I saw one for $140, a thing that you can put onto your iPhone if you want to get started.
Yeah, it's actually funny. I don't know. It's kind of hard to see the graphic behind me, but I have a couple pictures. Maybe I can send them to you for your website or something. We actually did that very thing. It's called a FLIR 1 camera, and it just plugs into my iPhone. And we've gone around to all these different locations in the city and taken a regular picture, and then we just overlay the infrared image on top of that. And what's been really cool is that we've been able to actually look at areas where we have a lot of different landforms, and we can rank how hot they are by what they're made out of. And then what that does is it provides the city people, so the city government, with a list of kind of priority things. Like, we really don't want to use this one specific type of asphalt because it's the hottest surface that you can even imagine. And then, we found something really amazing is that native plants are cooler than is that dry grass, like dry lawns, are just as warm as sidewalks. Now, that was something that we weren't expecting to find. But basically, if you have this big area of grass, if it's dry, you don't have a lot of access to water, it's going to act like a big parking lot.
No way.
Yeah. So using these like really simple technologies, I mean, $140 is a lot for people, for some people. And what's really amazing, though, is that by using that, we gain this really intuitive understanding of the built environment in at least our city. So it's worked here. I imagine that it'll work in other places.
I think just once you can show people information visually, it has a really powerful effect. There's a great quote, or maybe it's an interview with Rebecca Moore, who started up Google Earth. She was one of the main engineers on it. And she said that she had this information about trees that were being cut down in the Santa Cruz Mountains where she lived. And it was just written down on a piece of paper, the locations. And it didn't seem to have that much gravitas when it was just numbers on a piece of paper. But then she mapped it out using this kind of nascent, when Google Earth was very early. And then it just looked like these big, profound spaces that people had really strong emotional connections to. And then she showed it all around her community. Everyone got super psyched out, and they just like canned all of the logging around the mountains. And the story really was about the strong emotional impact that maps have. Once you can see data on a map, it's like boom, it really affects people. Did you have any experiences when you suddenly had all this data that was mapped in such detail that had that emotional impression on people?
Yeah, totally. I think, a lot of people were surprised at where some of the hotspots were. Invariably, if you have a city map, and we actually went even outside of the city of Richmond, the first thing that people do is zoom in on their house. So almost without fail, I think that first step, then they go to familiar places. They go and see, oh, wow, this golf course is actually a little bit of a heat island. Why is that? And then we get to talk about that grass thing that I was telling you about. Then they move to places where they go to dinner. Oh, I know that this restaurant is at the corner of this street and this street. Like, oh, wow, that's actually a really big heat island right there. It's just, they get to explore this environment that they live in every day in this new way. Maybe they intuitively felt, because walking down the street, you can feel, like I said, that like feeling of being in a mouth and then being under a tree and then being, in a mixed use kind of area, like that kind of experience is always there. But then when you get to see it laid out, like you said, kind of in relation to one another, it becomes this whole new story that you can investigate. And so looking at like this thing back behind me is like our vulnerability map, and the darker reds are areas where you have the more vulnerable populations. And if we take these images taken with the infrared camera, that we can show them where in their neighborhood are those places that are making it hotter, then we get to actually start helping them understand what are the possible solutions to that heat island effect in their own neighborhood. And I think really this is just like you said a little while ago, is that this is really like this opportunity to promote this kind of, environmental equity in our cities that we weren't able to do before without this information.
Yeah, and that's one thing I think is just so exciting and fun about detailed data, being able to create these visual maps or infographics that can emotionally connect with people in a way that just numbers don't quite do. But I think it's just a really beautiful new phase of sustainability going through. I also do a bit of infographic design, so I'm like really, I just love all any way that I can tell the story of sustainability in a way that's beautiful, I think is really compelling. Okay, to start wrapping up, there's one question that I love to ask people, which is, what is the thing that really moves you deeply about this cause? I can tell that you're super excited about it, but is there just one thing that you can define that, gets you excited to wake up in the morning and work on this issue?
That's a really good question, Katie. And I think the Science Museum of Virginia's mission, where I work, our mission is to help inspire Virginians to enrich their lives through science. And what I find really elegant about the urban heat island effect is that it really has this scientific solution to it that we can all intuitively understand. Our organization strives to make this information accessible to our citizens. And then we actually get to work on this problem with our citizens. And then our citizens and our visitors get to actually take that information and make their, really truly enrich their lives through fixing this issue in their cities. It's just this really beautiful my own little feedback loop that I get to see play out every single day, that I think a lot of scientists maybe don't have this connection, this really deep connection with their city government and their, and collaborators in their cities, don't get to explore every day. But at a science museum, we really get to, and it's our mission to do this. I'm really, really fortunate that I get to have my own little science feedback loop every single day.
Oh, that's really exciting to hear, because it's really what I'm trying to impress upon people with this whole How to Save the World podcast and website and book that I'm putting together, which is that trying to save the world when you're not effective, I think, is really depressing. I think a lot of people are trying to create change in the world, and they're kind of coming from a negative, angry space that terrible things are happening in the world. We're fighting this great beast. And I see another type of person that's very different, which is really inspired, really exciting, pushing innovation forward, having wins, having great connections. And I think the secret to it is that what they're doing is working. Well, not saying that the other people it's not working, but they can see that it's working. So when you can see that you're implementing a campaign and it worked, when you're implementing any kind of initiative, you're making recycling rates go up or carbon dioxide go down or water saving or saving lives, and you can really see that, like you said, in your own personal feedback loop. That's where the real magic of becoming a world changer, or the word I use to call the community. You really get that magical sensation of like, there's nothing really quite like it. Like, oh my God, I actually changed something in a positive way. And changing the world doesn't need to be a negative, depressing thing at all. I firmly think it should not be, that it's a great creative moment. So I just think that's really cool that you are experiencing that, and that's driving your own creativity and innovation forward, which leads to my last question, another question I love to ask people. If you could look over 100 years and have one win through this work, you could just pick one thing that you could look over 100 years and be like, I did that, I changed that thing. What would you pick?
Of the two things that I think we solved the most by fighting the urban heat island effect, which is either the kind of energy use or these people being vulnerable to urban heat. In the city of Richmond, there are specific communities that we've identified as more vulnerable. If over 100 years we start to see that the vulnerability in that maybe the people aren't actually going to the hospital as much, if I could see a decrease in the visits to urgent care centers, ambulance rides, and emergency departments, if the number of people going there for heat-related illness in the city of Richmond decreases, even as our summers continue to get hotter, I would consider that the number one win. By reducing that kind of health impact, that negative health impact of climate change and the urban heat island effect on our citizens, if that could go down, and because I'm a scientist, if we could tie that to our study in
it's going to be causation, not correlation.
In a causal way, yeah. If I could actually determine causation. I think overall, though, I would just love to see less human harm due to heat in the city of Richmond. That would be enough for me.
That would be your big win. As the tagline is, creating real and measurable change. That's what it's all about.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for coming on the show. This has been just an awesome conversation, Jeremy. I hope the listeners are not too frightened now about urban heat islands and heat stroke and all these terrible effects. I hope you are really inspired about what you can do in your communities to help add more green space, green roofs, green walls, trees, gardens, planters, paint something white, whatever you can do. What I've gotten from this conversation is that we can actually create a really positive impact in the world, and we can actually change the world by just making more gardens and more plants. If you are listening to the podcast, you can also watch us having this conversation, and you can also see this lovely image behind Jeremy on the YouTube channel. Make sure you subscribe, look up How to Save the World. And if you're on the YouTube channel and you want to listen, you can jump onto iTunes and subscribe to the podcast there. And make sure you also subscribe to my website, katiepatrick.com. I have a whole bunch of free resources that you can download on how to use data visualization, design, and gamification and behavioral psychology to help turn your dreams for a better world into real and measurable change.